The waiter's silver tray shimmered under the restaurant's warm lights as he began laying out plates of steak, one by one, around the long mahogany table. The scent of seared meat and buttered herbs floated through the air, wrapping the evening in a false sense of luxury. I watched the plates land in front of my husband, Daniel, then his mother, his sister, his brother, and finally, his father, Richard Coleman, who sat at the head like a king surveying his court. When the waiter stepped behind me, I straightened instinctively, expecting my plate next. But the man hesitated, glanced nervously toward Richard, then moved on. Everyone's meal was served, except mine. A small laugh rippled down the table, not loud enough to be called cruel, but sharp enough to slice through my composure. I kept my hands folded in my lap, hoping anyone, would notice. Richard did. His smile was thin and deliberate, the kind that belonged on someone who'd waited all evening for this moment. "I only order for family," he said, swirling his wine before taking a slow sip. The words dripped with satisfaction, like a verdict finally delivered. The chatter at the table died instantly. The clink of silverware, the hum of background music, everything faded until all I could hear was the faint pounding in my chest. Daniel's fork hovered midair. His eyes darted between me and his father, panic rising in his face, but he didn't say a word. His silence was louder than Richard's insult. I forced a small smile, the kind that says, "I won't give you the reaction you want," but my throat burned. "Am I not family?" I asked quietly, not to provoke, but because the question had lived too long inside me. Daniel muttered, "Not here, Emma, please." My name trembled in his mouth, carrying both guilt and fear. Around us, the rest of the family exchanged awkward glances, his sister pretending to check her phone, his mother stirring her wine like she could drown the tension in it. But Richard leaned back in his chair, enjoying the discomfort like fine art. For 7 years, I had learned to read that man's smirks, the way his politeness was always sharpened into something that could cut. From the first day I met him, he treated me like a stray dog that had wandered into his pristine garden. At first, I thought I could win him over, with effort, patience, kindness. But kindness means nothing to people who measure worth in bloodlines and bank accounts. Tonight's dinner wasn't just a meal. It was the latest round in a war he'd been waging quietly for years, a battle of dignity dressed up as civility. The waiter, poor man, looked mortified. He leaned down beside me, whispering that he'd bring another plate right away. Richard waved him off with a flick of his wrist. "No need. We wouldn't want to waste food." A cruel chuckle followed. My face burned, but I steadied my breathing, focusing on the soft linen of the napkin in my lap. Don't cry here, not in front of him. Memories flashed. Every gathering, every cutting remark disguised as a joke, the Christmas when he gifted everyone engraved pens and watches and handed me a scented candle labeled "For Guests." The time he asked Daniel at the dinner table, "Do social workers even make enough to pay for real vacations?" The way he'd introduced me to his business friends as Daniel's wife, the idealist, as though it were a punchline. I'd spent years convincing myself that if I stayed patient, he'd eventually see me for who I was. But sitting there with an empty placemat in front of me, I realized patience had only trained him to disrespect me more efficiently. Daniel tried again, this time whispering, "Emma, we'll talk later." But the damage was done. My humiliation wasn't private. It was a spectacle, and everyone was complicit. The sound of knives cutting into meat filled the silence. My stomach twisted. I didn't even want the food anymore. I wanted an answer, a reason. Why invite me if you planned to humiliate me? Why pretend this was a family dinner if you never intended to treat me like family? I looked around the table. His sister Charlotte, who inherited their father's arrogance and was already smirking behind her wine glass. his brother Michael avoiding my eyes but gripping his fork a little too tightly, his mother Evelyn, delicate and distant, offering me a weak, apologetic smile that said, "I can't control him." They all played their parts, just as they always had. And me? I was the guest who didn't belong, the woman who had been tolerated out of politeness, but never accepted. Still, something inside me shifted that night. Not a spark of rage, but something colder, sharper. I was tired of swallowing disrespect in the name of peace. I didn't want another apology whispered in the car on the way home, another promise from Daniel that he'll come around someday. That day never came. It never would. Because men like Richard don't come around. They push until you break, or until you push back. The air around the table felt heavier with each passing second. The laughter returned in fragments, forced and hollow. Richard cut his steak, looked at Daniel, and said, "Son, a man should always remember where he came from." His tone was casual, but the meaning was a dagger aimed straight at me. I leaned forward slightly and said, calm and steady, "And sometimes a man should remember who he's married to." The words froze everyone mid-bite. For a heartbeat, even Richard's confidence faltered. His eyes flicked to mine, measuring whether I just made a mistake or declared a challenge. I didn't blink. For the first time in years, I didn't look away. He smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Careful, Emma. Pride doesn't suit people who forget their place." I let out a quiet breath and replied, "Neither does cruelty." The table fell silent again. The waiter returned with a plate, a steak identical to the others, and placed it gently in front of me, despite Richard's earlier command. I thanked him softly. Then I picked up my knife and fork, cutting into the meat with deliberate calm. I could feel Richard's glare burning into me, but I didn't flinch, because for the first time, his approval meant absolutely nothing. Inside, I knew something fundamental had shifted. Tonight wouldn't just be another evening of quiet humiliation followed by tears behind a locked bathroom door. This was the night that would start to unravel everything: my marriage, my fear, my silence. What I didn't know yet was how quickly the cracks would spread, or how one act of quiet defiance at a dinner table would expose every secret this family tried to bury. But as I chewed that first bite, forcing a smile, I realized something powerful. Richard had always wanted to make me feel small, but humiliation had stopped working. And once shame stops working, fear loses its power. That was the moment, though none of them knew it yet, that the real story began. People always talk about the first time they meet their partner's family, as if it's some rite of passage. The test you either pass or fail. My first encounter with Richard Coleman felt less like a test and more like an interview I didn't know I was attending. It happened 6 months after Daniel proposed. We drove to his parents' estate in Maple Hills, a place so perfectly landscaped it looked like the hedges had been disciplined into obedience. Daniel was nervous. I could feel it in how tightly he gripped the steering wheel. "Dad's a little intense," he warned. "But once he gets to know you, he'll like you." That assurance was the first of many empty promises that would dissolve over the years like sugar and water. Richard greeted us at the door wearing a navy blazer, the kind that screamed quiet authority. He had the handshake of a man who thought power was physical, firm, controlling, unyielding. "So, this is Emma," he said, his eyes scanning me the way a jeweler inspects a stone, looking for flaws. Before I could respond, he added, "Daniel mentioned you work with, what was it again? Troubled families?" The way he said it made my profession sound contagious. I explained that I was a social worker focused on housing stability. He nodded once, his expression unreadable. "Rewarding work, I suppose," he said, then smiled just enough to make it clear he didn't mean it. Evelyn, my future mother-in-law, floated into the foyer a moment later, her perfume trailing behind her like a veil of roses and regret. She hugged Daniel warmly and offered me a handshake so delicate it felt like she was afraid I might bruise her. "Welcome, dear. You must be exhausted from the drive," she said, already turning toward the dining room. Behind her, the house gleamed. Marble floors, oil paintings of ancestors I'd never heard of, and an air that whispered, old money. I suddenly felt underdressed in my floral dress and scuffed heels. Daniel noticed my discomfort and squeezed my hand under the table when we sat down for lunch. It was a small gesture, but one that told me he knew exactly what I was feeling, that I didn't belong here. The first meal went better than I expected, at least on the surface. Richard asked Daniel about his work at the firm, congratulated him on his latest project, and made a few jokes about how real men still believe in spreadsheets, not feelings. Every time I tried to join the conversation, his eyes flicked toward me like I'd interrupted something sacred. When dessert came, he poured wine for everyone except me, claiming, "We'll keep Emma sober. She's the responsible one." The others laughed, and I laughed too, though the sound didn't reach my chest. On the drive home, I told Daniel it felt strange. He sighed and said, "That's just Dad. He doesn't mean anything by it." But the truth was, Richard meant everything by it. Every remark, every gesture was deliberate. Small reminders of hierarchy. Over the next few months, those reminders multiplied. He'd invite us for dinner and speak to me through Daniel, never directly. "Tell your wife she should try the roast. It's better than anything store-bought." Once, when I brought a homemade pie for Thanksgiving, he cut a slice, took one bite, and said, "You know, Emma, presentation counts a lot in life." He then placed his fork down and didn't touch the rest. Each slight was wrapped in charm, making it impossible to call out without sounding overly sensitive. It was psychological chess, and he was a grand master. Daniel, meanwhile, kept shrinking in his father's shadow. He was brilliant, kind, but conditioned to please. When Richard disapproved, Daniel bent. When Richard complimented him, he glowed. I learned quickly that standing up for myself meant standing against the man my husband idolized. I tried diplomacy first. I'd compliment Richard's business acumen, ask his opinion on current events, laugh at his jokes. Nothing softened him. To him, I was an outsider who had stolen his son's potential. Once, after dinner, he even said it outright. Daniel could have married into the Parkers or the Sloans, families with influence. Instead, he married Hart. His tone made Hart sound like a liability. Despite the tension, there were brief moments of grace. Evelyn occasionally called me just to chat, her voice trembling with an unspoken apology she'd never put into words. She confided that Richard wasn't always this hard. Success had carved away the softer parts of him. Michael, the younger son, was the only one who treated me like family. He'd wink when his father made a snide comment, silently letting me know I wasn't crazy for hearing the malice hidden in Richard's jokes. Sometimes he'd call afterward to check in. "Don't let him get to you. He just needs to feel in control." Those calls became my lifeline. Yet, no matter how many times I told myself I could handle it, the wake of those dinners lingered long after they ended. I'd come home and scrub dishes furiously, as if I could wash away the humiliation stuck under my skin. Daniel would hold me and say, "You're overthinking it," not realizing that dismissing pain doesn't erase it, it just teaches you to hide it deeper. Still, I kept showing up. Every holiday, every birthday, every family event. Because that's what Daniel wanted. And back then, keeping peace in our marriage felt more important than demanding respect from his father.
Then came the year of the Coleman family fundraiser, the event that solidified everything I'd suspected but refused to accept. It was an evening gala at a downtown hotel. Daniel and I arrived hand in hand, both dressed in black. As we approached the table marked Coleman family, the host stopped me. "I'm sorry, miss," he said, glancing at the list. "You're seated at table 14 with the staff volunteers." I laughed, thinking it was a mix-up. But when Daniel went to correct it, Richard appeared behind him. "It's fine," he told the host. "Emma offered to help with the raffle tickets." I hadn't. The humiliation was surgical, clean, precise, undeniable. I spent the night handing out prize slips while watching my husband sip champagne at his father's table. When I confronted Daniel later, he said Dad didn't mean it that way. He just wanted the evening to run smoothly. That was when I realized the truth. Richard didn't need to destroy me. He just needed to make me invisible. After that night, something in me changed. I started seeing my marriage in fragments. Daniel's apologies, my compromises, Richard's control. Pieces that no longer fit together. But still I hoped. Hope is the cruelest kind of endurance. It convinces you that love can fix contempt. I told myself that one day Richard would see my loyalty, that Daniel would finally draw a line, and that the family I married into would start treating me as one of their own. I didn't know then that the next family dinner, the one with the steaks and desserts, would become the moment that shattered that illusion for good. So when I sat at that table months later, staring at the empty plate mat in front of me, I wasn't just humiliated. I was enlightened. I could trace every bruise on my heart back to the first handshake at the door, to every polite insult and swallowed protest. The dinner wasn't an isolated cruelty. It was the inevitable conclusion to a pattern I'd allowed to thrive. And as I watched Richard smirk across the table, I realized the question wasn't whether I belonged in their family. It was whether I still wanted to.
After the fundraiser humiliation, the space between Daniel and me began to stretch in invisible ways. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It was erosion, slow, patient, and silent. In the mornings, he'd scroll through emails while I sat across from him with my untouched coffee, trying to start small conversations that dissolved into half-hearted nods. Nights grew quieter, too. When he used to come home, he'd kiss my forehead and ask about my day. Now he'd slip into bed smelling faintly of whiskey and exhaustion, murmuring that the timing wasn't right to challenge his father about anything. I wanted to believe him, to keep giving him time. But love can't survive indefinitely on postponed courage. Richard's presence seeped into our marriage like humidity. You didn't see it, but it warped everything. He'd call Daniel to check on business, and I'd hear snippets of their conversations from the kitchen. "You're wasting too much energy on sentiment. Focus on advancement." Or, "A man's wife reflects his ambition. Don't let her hold you back." Each line planted small seeds of doubt in Daniel's mind. I could feel them growing. Whenever I talked about switching to a new program that served underprivileged youth, he'd sigh, "Maybe wait until things are more stable." Stability, in his vocabulary, meant Dad's approval. Weekends became rituals of avoidance. On Saturdays, we used to explore thrift markets and small cafes downtown. Now we spent them at the Coleman's estate because Dad wanted to discuss something. Something always turned into hours of polite interrogation. Richard would pour bourbon for the men, herbal tea for the women, then talk about legacy. He loved that word. It rolled off his tongue like a sermon. "A family's strength depends on order," he'd say, eyes fixed on me, and order depends on knowing one's place. His smile never reached his eyes. Evelyn would nod faintly, lost somewhere behind her practiced grace, while Michael would sit in silence, fiddling with his watch.
I sometimes caught his sympathetic glance, but he never intervened. No one ever did. One Sunday, after a particularly condescending lunch where Richard compared my public service salary to pocket money, Daniel confronted me in the car. Could you try not to react when Dad talks like that? It just makes things harder. His words stunned me. React? I asked. Daniel, I sat there and smiled while he insulted my career. He rubbed his temples. He's old school. He doesn't understand what you do. It's not worth the fight. That night, I lay awake realizing he wasn't defending me anymore. He was managing me, smoothing me down so I'd fit better into his father's world. The next few months blurred together. I drew myself to work, staying late at the shelter to help families who had nowhere else to go. The contrast was brutal. In my job, people with nothing still found ways to share warmth. In my marriage, surrounded by everything, I felt cold. When I came home, the lights were often dim. Daniel hunched over his laptop, chasing promotions that Richard dangled like bait. The few dinners we managed together were filled with careful politeness, words tiptoeing around unspoken truths. Then came the family-only lake house weekend. Richard announced it during one of those estate lunches. "We're heading up to Silver Pine Cabin next month," he said, his eyes glinting. "Just family, no plus ones this time. We'll talk business, bond a little." He looked at Daniel. "Yo come, of course." My stomach tightened. Daniel hesitated before replying, "Of course." Later that night, I asked, "So that doesn't include me?" He avoided my eyes. "It's just a tradition thing, Em. Dad's weird about these retreats. It's not personal." But everything about it was personal. The week before the trip, I found myself packing anyway, half out of hope, half out of denial. I imagined showing up and proving once again that I belonged. On the morning of departure, we stopped by Richard's house to load up the car. I went inside to use the restroom. When I came out, the driveway was empty. The echo of silence hit before my comprehension did. I called Daniel's phone. No answer. I stood there, suitcase in hand, staring at the fading tire tracks on the gravel. 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text. "I'll explain later. Dad thought it should be just family." The message was simple, almost casual, but it detonated something inside me. I dropped the suitcase and sat on the porch steps, the morning sun burning my skin. For a long time, I couldn't move. The humiliation was so complete, it felt absurd, like I was watching it happen to someone else. My phone buzzed again, a missed call from Michael. When I finally answered, his voice was low. "Emma, I didn't know they'd do that. I tried to stop them." I wanted to believe him. He offered to drive back and pick me up, but I said no. I didn't want another Coleman rescuing me from the Colemans. That night, I slept on the couch, surrounded by silence. The next day, Daniel came home as if nothing had happened. "Dad felt it was a business thing," he explained, shrugging as though I were overreacting. "It wasn't about you." I looked at him for a long time before asking, "Then who was it about?" He didn't answer. Something inside me hardened after that. I stopped trying to please his father. At dinners, I no longer laughed at Richard's jokes. I stopped bringing dishes or gifts. I spoke only when spoken to. My tone calm, deliberate, distant. Strangely, that bothered him more than my politeness ever had. He thrived on visible discomfort. My indifference deprived him of it. Once during a family brunch, he commented, "Emma's finally learning when to keep quiet." I smiled and said, "Silence is underrated. It lets you hear who people really are." The room froze. For a split second, I thought Evelyn might actually smile. Meanwhile, Daniel's guilt began to flicker, but never quite catch fire. He'd bring home flowers after every blow-up with his father, as if flowers could replace apologies. He'd whisper, "Just hold on, Em. Once Dad retires, things will change." But I'd stop believing in after. Life was happening now, and I was tired of postponing my dignity. Michael stayed in touch more often after the lake house incident. We talk on the phone sometimes about neutral things, books, travel, small jokes. But beneath every conversation was a quiet understanding that he saw what was happening. One evening, he said softly, "You know, you don't owe anyone your silence." I didn't respond, but the words lodged deep inside me. As the months passed, Richard's behavior became even more performative. He'd praise Charlotte's engagement, brag about Michael's job, and then turn to me with a patronizing smile. "And Emma, still doing charity work, yes? So noble." I'd nod, letting him mistake restraint for weakness. What he didn't realize was that every insult was chiseling away not my self-worth, but my attachment. By the time he invited everyone for the annual August luncheon, the one where he'd eventually serve steaks to everyone except for me, I was no longer the woman desperate to belong. I was something far more dangerous to a man like Richard Coleman. I was indifferent. That upcoming luncheon would be my final performance in the Coleman Theater. But unlike before, I wasn't showing up to endure. I was showing up to end it. What I didn't yet know was that fate had arranged an unexpected ally, someone within his own family, and that his calculated cruelty that afternoon would backfire in a way even Richard Coleman couldn't control.
By August, the Coleman estate was buzzing with preparations for the family luncheon, a yearly ritual dressed in tradition but pulsing with ego. Richard treated it like a royal banquet, complete with assigned seating, floral arrangements imported from Italy, and a caterer who cost more than most people's monthly rent. He said it was about celebrating family unity, but in reality, it was his stage, a chance to reaffirm his control, to remind everyone that the Coleman hierarchy began and ended with him. And this year, I had no illusions left about my place in that hierarchy. Still, I decided to attend, not out of loyalty or fear, but because I wanted to see things clearly, to stop letting Daniel's excuses blur reality. I chose a simple navy blue dress, nothing flashy, no makeup beyond a touch of mascara. I wanted to look like myself, not the version they tolerated. When I arrived with Daniel, the long dining table gleamed like something out of a magazine spread. Polished silverware, crystal glasses, perfectly folded napkins, every detail screamed perfection. Yet beneath that shine, I could sense the undercurrent of tension that always hovered around these gatherings. Evelyn, as usual, floated in the background, managing the caterers with quiet precision. Her movements were practiced, almost mechanical, like someone who'd been doing this for decades, without ever asking why. Grico greeted me warmly, his smile gentle, genuine, a stark contrast to Daniel's tight-lipped discomfort. Charlotte was there too, her fiancé bragging about his recent business deal, and the cousins murmured in admiration. Richard, standing at the head of the table, looked like a king surveying his court. When his eyes met mine, his lips curved into that polished, patronizing smile I'd come to despise. "Emma," he said, "I see you finally learned how to be punctual." I smiled back. Traffic was late. Guess I ran out of excuses. The first half hour went as expected. Shallow conversation, exaggerated laughter, and the constant hum of pretense. Richard dominated the table with stories of his youth, always ending with some moral about discipline and ambition. Every time Daniel tried to contribute, his father interrupted, gently correcting him as though he were still a boy. I watched, not with pity, but with a strange calm. For the first time, I saw how small Richard's empire really was, built not on respect, but on fear. When the servers began bringing out the main course, I noticed something odd. Each guest received a plate of perfectly grilled steak, glazed carrots, and rosemary potatoes. The aroma filled the air, rich and indulgent. But when my plate arrived, it was empty. Just a plain salad, no dressing, no protein, nothing warm. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I waited for someone to notice, maybe for Daniel to speak up. He didn't. He cut his steak in silence, eyes fixed on his plate. Richard was the first to acknowledge it. "Ah, Emma, I thought you mentioned you were cutting back on red meat." His tone was casual, but his smirk gave him away.
The entire table went quiet. Evelyn froze mid-sip, her eyes darting between us. "No," I said evenly. "I didn't say that." He chuckled, slicing into his steak. "Must have misheard. No worries. The salad's healthy, keeps the figure in check." Laughter rippled weakly around the table, uncertain and forced. I felt a rush of heat rise to my cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from clarity. This wasn't about food. It was about power, a public reminder that I didn't belong. And Daniel? He kept eating, every chew sounding louder in the silence. I looked at him and asked, "Am I not family, Daniel?" The question slipped out, calm but sharp enough to slice through the tension. He swallowed hard, avoiding my gaze. "Don't do this. Not here," he muttered. But the words were already hanging in the air, electric and irreversible. The room fell utterly silent. Even the clinking of silverware stopped. Richard leaned back, studying me like I was an experiment in defiance. He said, "Family, Emma, is a matter of blood and legacy. You married into it, but legacy is earned, not taken." The words dripped with arrogance. Around the table, faces shifted, some uncomfortable, some indifferent. Only Michael looked directly at me, his jaw tight, his knuckles white around his fork. I could have walked out right then. That's what he wanted, to watch me crumble, to confirm that his cruelty still had power. But something inside me refused. I straightened my back, lifted my fork, and said softly, "You're right, Richard. Legacy is earned." Which makes me wonder what kind of legacy humiliates people for sport. His smirk falters for just a heartbeat. No one dared breathe. Then Evelyn's fork slipped from her hand, clattering against the china. The sound broke the silence, and conversations resumed in strained whispers. The dessert course came next. Chocolate soufflés plated with edible gold. Everyone got one, except me. My plate remained empty again. The audacity of it was almost absurd. This time, even Charlotte looked uneasy. Daniel whispered, "Let's just go home." I looked at him, this man who once told me I was the strongest woman he knew, and realized he was terrified, not of losing me, but of losing his father's approval. I said no, quietly. "You go ahead if you want. I'm fine here." Michael stood abruptly. He said, "That's enough, Dad. You've made your point." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Point? I'm simply maintaining standards." Michael shook his head. "No, you're maintaining control. There's a difference." The air in the room shifted. The first real crack in Richard's authority. For once, he didn't have a quick retort. His jaw tightened. Evelyn rose, excused herself, and disappeared into the kitchen, her composure finally breaking. I didn't eat a single bite that day, but I left the table more full than I ever had been, full of clarity, full of quiet rage, full of resolve. And as I stood to leave, I looked Richard in the eye and said, "You know, I used to wonder what it would take for me to feel like part of this family. Now I know the answer. Nothing, because I already have my own." Then I turned and walked out, my heels echoing on the marble floor. When Daniel followed me to the car, he tried to explain, to smooth things over yet again, but I cut him off. "Stop protecting him," I said. "He's not your father. He's your prison." He didn't reply. He just sat there, staring out the windshield, a man caught between loyalty and shame. The drive home was silent, heavy, final. That night, I lay awake thinking about what had happened, not the humiliation, but the moment after, when I'd seen fear flicker in Richard's eyes. For the first time, he'd realized I wasn't his victim anymore. I wasn't angry at Daniel, not exactly. I pitied him, but pity can only stretch so far before it snaps. And though I didn't know it yet, that day's cruelty would set in motion a chain of events that would destroy Richard's perfect image, not through revenge, but through truth. Because the next time I walked into that house, I wouldn't be the outsider. I'd be the storm they never saw coming.
The silence after the luncheon was suffocating, the kind that follows a storm but doesn't bring calm, only debris. Daniel and I drove home without a single word. The rhythmic hum of the highway filled the car, a steady reminder of everything unsaid between us. His hands gripped the steering wheel like he was holding the pieces of something crumbling, and maybe he was. When we finally reached home, he went straight to his office and shut the door. I sat at the kitchen table, still in my navy dress, staring at my reflection in the window. A woman who had finally seen her marriage for what it was, a contract signed under pressure, not a partnership built on respect. That night, Daniel emerged hours later, eyes red and tired. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I didn't know he'd do that." I looked at him, wondering if he believed his own words. "You didn't stop him either." My voice wasn't loud, but it landed heavy. He winced. "You think it's that easy? He's my father, Emma. You don't understand what it's like." I stood. "No, Daniel, you don't understand what it's like to sit at a table surrounded by people who pretend you don't exist, while your own husband pretends not to see it." He said nothing, just turned away. That night, we slept in the same bed, but the distance between us was vast, a canyon carved by years of silent compromises. The next morning, the fallout began, quietly, in whispers. Evelyn called, her voice trembling. "Emma, I wanted to say I'm sorry." Richard was out of line. The apology was cautious, fragmented. I could tell she was terrified he'd overhear. "It's not your fault," I said gently. "It never was." There was a pause, then she whispered, "You were right about legacy. He's built one out of fear." That was the first time I heard honesty from her, and the last time for a while. At work, I tried to lose myself in routine. Spreadsheets, budgets, volunteer signups, but my mind kept circling back to that table, to the way Daniel had stayed silent, to the way Michael had stood up. Something about that moment, the small rebellion from within, stayed with me. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming my voice. I realized I'd spent years trying to earn acceptance from people who measured worth by obedience. It was time to stop trying and start rebuilding on my terms. 3 days after the luncheon, I got an email from Michael. Short, careful. "If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm around." That wasn't right, and I'm sorry I didn't do more sooner. I didn't reply immediately, but his words lingered. Not because they flattered me, but because they carried sincerity, something rare in the Coleman household. A week later, he stopped by my office, claiming he was in the neighborhood. We talked for almost an hour, about everything except the luncheon. He mentioned how his father's control had shaped all of them, how Daniel's obedience wasn't weakness but survival. "He's been conditioned to fold," he said. "Since we were kids, Dad rewards compliance, punishes defiance. You either become him or hide from him." I listened quietly, feeling the puzzle pieces click. "And you?" I asked. "Which one are you?" He smiled sadly. "The one who's finally tired of hiding." There was no ulterior motive in his tone, no flirtation, just shared exhaustion from years of walking on eggshells. That conversation didn't fix anything, but it gave me something I hadn't felt in months: perspective. Meanwhile, Daniel avoided the topic like it was radioactive. He buried himself in work, coming home later each night. When he did speak, it was about mundane things: bills, groceries, weather. Never us. I stopped trying to draw him out. Let the silence be his refuge. I had my own to tend to. One evening, while sorting laundry, I found a receipt in his jacket pocket. A dinner bill from a fancy restaurant across town, dated 2 nights ago.
The signature at the bottom wasn't his handwriting. It was feminine, looping, deliberate. My heart didn't break. It simply went still. It wasn't about betrayal, it was confirmation. The distance between us hadn't just been emotional, it had been physical too. When he got home that night, I didn't confront him. I wasn't ready yet. I needed to be strategic, not reactive. A few days later, Evelyn called again, more distressed this time. "He's been furious since that day," she whispered. "He's making life miserable for Michael, says he embarrassed the family by speaking out." My grip on the phone tightened. "Michael doesn't deserve that." "None of you do," she said, her voice cracking. "You were right to stand up to him. I wish I had." That night, I sat at my desk and began writing. Not a letter of confrontation, but a story. The story of a family built on appearances, of women erased in the name of legacy, of power masquerading as tradition. It wasn't about revenge, it was about documentation. I wrote everything, every snub, every slight, every manipulation, until dawn broke through the curtains. The next day, I emailed a few paragraphs anonymously to a small online column that specialized in real-life stories of family toxicity and control. I didn't name names, but the world of the story was unmistakably familiar to anyone who knew us. Within days, the article caught traction. Readers flooded the comments with outrage, empathy, and speculation. I didn't expect it to spread, but it did. A local journalist even referenced it in a podcast about generational control. I never admitted I'd written it, not even to Daniel, but the ripple had begun. Richard's ego, I later learned, took the hit harder than anyone imagined. He suspected Evelyn or Michael had leaked family gossip. His temper grew volcanic, his control slipping. Ironically, his own obsession with appearances kept him from publicly addressing it. But behind closed doors, he lashed out. Daniel came home one night, his face pale. "Dad's losing it," he said. "He thinks someone's trying to ruin him." I looked at him and said, "Maybe he's just seeing himself clearly for once." In the weeks that followed, Michael and I stayed in touch, cautiously but consistently. Our bond wasn't romantic, it was revolutionary. Two people quietly refusing to play the roles Richard had assigned them. He'd been cut off from his inheritance for betrayal, but he said it was the freest he'd felt in years. I envied that freedom and began craving my own. Then, one evening, while Daniel was at yet another networking dinner, I received an invitation, not from the Colemans, but from the city's Women's Empowerment Network. They'd read my anonymous story and wanted me to speak at an event about resilience and toxic family dynamics. My first instinct was fear, exposure, but then I realized hiding was exactly what people like Richard counted on. I accepted. That decision, though small at the time, would set the stage for everything that came next. The unraveling of Richard's control, the breaking of Daniel's denial, and my emergence not as the outsider daughter-in-law, but as the voice they tried so hard to silence. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like the outsider. I felt like the catalyst.
The night of the women's empowerment event arrived with the kind of nervous electricity that used to make me tremble. But not this time. I felt calm, deliberate, like a woman walking towards something she was always meant to face. The venue was modest, a renovated art gallery downtown, but it glowed with soft lights and the quiet hum of women sharing stories, laughter, and survival. When I took the stage, my hands didn't shake. I wasn't there to expose anyone. I was there to tell the truth, my truth, stripped of names but rich in reality. My story, I began, my voice steady, isn't about one cruel dinner or one dismissive comment.
It's about years of learning how to make myself smaller so others could feel bigger. It's about mistaking silence for peace. The audience leaned in, some nodded, some wiped tears. I continued, describing how subtle cruelty hides behind manners, how exclusion can look like politeness, and how control often dresses up as tradition. I spoke about the night I was served nothing, the laughter that followed, and how that empty plate was the most valuable meal I ever received because it fed my clarity. By the time I finished, the room was still. Then came applause, the kind that doesn't explode but rises like a wave, steady and full of empathy. I smiled, not because I wanted validation, but because I finally felt seen. Afterward, women approached me with stories of their own, controlling in-laws, belittling partners, families that measured worth in compliance. It was as if my words had unlocked something collective. I went home that night feeling lighter, freer. But freedom has a cost. 2 days later, the video of my speech went viral. Someone from the audience had filmed it, uploaded it to social media with the caption, "Every woman who's ever been made to feel like she doesn't belong, this is for you." The clip spread fast, resonating with thousands. The comment section overflowed with messages of solidarity. But there were others, ones from people who clearly recognized the undertones. Isn't this about the Coleman family? Sounds a lot like Richard Coleman's daughter-in-law. The whispers had begun. When Daniel came home that evening, he was pale, phone in hand. "Emma," he said, voice tight, "what did you do?" I looked up from the kitchen counter. "I told the truth. You embarrassed my family. You embarrassed yourself," I replied, my tone calm but unyielding. "The truth only hurts when it's real, Daniel." He threw his phone on the counter. "Dad saw it. He's furious. He said you've destroyed our reputation." I laughed, a sound that surprised even me. "Our reputation? Daniel, your father destroyed that years ago. I just stopped pretending it was intact." He stormed out that night, slamming the door behind him. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. The next morning, Evelyn came to see me. It was the first time she'd ever visited my home alone. She looked smaller than I remembered, tired, haunted. "She's unraveling," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He's called everyone trying to do damage control, but the story's out there. People are starting to see him for who he really is." She looked at me then, eyes shining. "Thank you." That word hit me like a gust of wind, gratitude from the woman who'd spent years in silent submission. "I didn't think." "Don't thank me," I said softly. "Just stop letting him silence you." For the first time, she nodded with conviction. Meanwhile, Michael reached out too. He'd seen the video and texted, "That was brave. He'll come after you, but you're not alone." I believed him. The storm I'd unleashed wasn't one of vengeance, but revelation, and Richard Coleman's empire thrived on secrecy. The moment truth touched it, the foundation cracked. A week later, I was at work when one of my colleagues showed me a news alert. Coleman Industries faces internal audit amid allegations of financial misconduct. My stomach dropped. The article mentioned inconsistencies in company funds, whistleblowers, and anonymous leaks. I hadn't leaked anything, but someone had. Later that night, Michael called. "He's losing everything," he said quietly. "The audit's exposing years of shady donations. I think Mom finally handed over the records." My breath caught. "Evelyn?" "Yeah," he said. "She said it's time people knew who he really was." The irony was poetic. The same man who'd weaponized shame was now drowning in it. Still, I didn't feel joy. What I felt was justice. Slow, quiet, and overdue. Daniel, meanwhile, was spiraling. His father's downfall was dragging him down too. He came home one night angry and disoriented. "Are you happy now?" he shouted. "You got what you wanted. My family's ruined." I looked at him, sadness replacing anger. "Daniel, your family isn't ruined. It's free. You just don't recognize freedom because you've only ever known control." He stared at me, eyes wide, like he was seeing me for the first time, not as his wife, not as an accessory to his father's empire, but as someone who had stepped outside it entirely. He left a week later, not with malice, but with resignation. A simple note on the kitchen counter: "I need to figure out who I am without him." For the first time, I believed he might actually do it. In the months that followed, the fallout spread like wildfire. Richard faced public scrutiny, his company's board demanded his resignation, and the family name, once synonymous with prestige, became a cautionary tale whispered in charity circles and boardrooms alike. Evelyn moved out quietly, renting a small apartment near the coast. She began volunteering at a women's shelter, the same kind she used to dismiss as for the unfortunate. Michael started consulting work, far from his father's shadow. And me, I kept writing. The Women's Network invited me back, this time as a keynote speaker. My inbox filled with letters from women who saw themselves in my story. Some were strangers, others confessed they were wives, daughters, or mothers trapped in similar golden cages. The more I read, the more I realized this wasn't just my battle, it was a collective reckoning. But even as I built something new, part of me wondered how far Richard would go to protect his pride. Men like him didn't just fade quietly, they imploded, taking everything within reach. That fear proved justified one evening when I received a letter, not an email, but a handwritten note, elegant and old-fashioned. It was from Richard. "Emma," it read, "you've made your point. You've embarrassed this family and dragged my name through the mud. But remember, every empire falls, and so do those who build their victory on its ashes. You think you're free, but freedom bought with betrayal is just another form of servitude." I folded the letter, placed it in a drawer, and smiled. Because for the first time, his words didn't sting. They sounded like the desperate ramblings of a man watching his reflection crack. He wanted me to feel fear, but all I felt was distance. That night, as I stood by the window looking out over the city lights, I realized something profound. Power doesn't disappear when you walk away from it. It follows you, reshaping itself into purpose. Richard had built his legacy on silence. I had turned mine into a voice. And though he still tried to intimidate, manipulate, and control, the truth was, his reign had ended the moment he served me that empty plate.
The letter from Richard sat in my drawer like a relic, proof that even when stripped of power, he still believed his words could command obedience. But something inside me had shifted too deeply to be moved by ink. I no longer feared him. I pitied him. Yet I knew one thing for certain. Men like Richard Coleman didn't go down quietly. They dragged others into the rubble, clawing for control even as their world crumbled, and I could already feel the tremors beginning. It started with the press. What began as whispers about financial misconduct turned into full-blown investigations. News outlets ran headlines that would have made Richard's blood boil. Coleman Industries under federal scrutiny, CEO accused of misuse of charity funds. Anonymous source claims internal cover-up. I knew none of it came from me, but Evelyn and Michael had reached their breaking point. After years of silence, they finally handed over proof of Richard's corrupt dealings. Fake donations, political bribes, forged accounts.
The empire he'd built wasn't just morally hollow, it was legally unstable. When Daniel showed up at my doorstep again, he looked like a ghost. His once proud posture had dissolved into exhaustion. "He's lost everything," he said quietly, stepping inside like a man who no longer knew where home was. The company froze his accounts. The board voted him out. He's not even allowed in the building anymore. His voice cracked, part grief, part disbelief. He just sits in his study, drinking, muttering about betrayal. I made tea, mostly to fill the silence. I asked softly, "And you? Where does that leave you, Daniel?" He rubbed his face, staring at the floor. "I don't know. For years, I thought loyalty meant obedience, that standing by him, no matter how cruel he was, made me strong. But now, I see what that did to you, what it did to Mom. I don't even know who I am without him." His words didn't come with expectation, just truth. And that truth was heavy, raw. For the first time, I didn't see my husband as my oppressor, but another casualty of his father's kingdom. I said, "Maybe this is your chance to find out." He nodded, eyes glassy. "You'd still talk to me after everything?" "I'm not interested in revenge, just peace. For both of us." It was a small moment, but monumental. Two people standing in the wreckage of a legacy, finally seeing each other without the filter of someone else's power. Meanwhile, Richard's fall was accelerating. The news cycle feasted on his downfall. Leaked emails, forged invoices, a trail of deceit stretching back over a decade. Politicians who once toasted him at galas now denied knowing him. Former partners distanced themselves overnight. His kingdom of influence crumbled, one headline at a time. But the most haunting part wasn't what he lost, it was how he reacted to losing it. Evelyn told me he'd started locking himself in his office, refusing food, ignoring calls. "She's obsessed," she said during one of our team meetings. "He keeps saying it's all a setup, that we've all turned on him." I could hear the guilt in her voice, the echo of decades spent cushioning his ego. "Evelyn," I said gently, "you didn't destroy him. You just stopped protecting the monster he became." She cried then, quiet, relieved tears, the kind that come when truth and grief finally meet. But Richard wasn't finished. A week later, I got a call from an unknown number. His voice on the other end was unmistakable, still sharp, still commanding, but trembling at the edges. "Emma," he said, "you think you've won? You think you're the hero in this story?" I didn't respond. I just listened. "You built your little fame on my name," he continued, bitterness coating every word. "You couldn't have existed without me. You owe everything to my cruelty, don't you? Without me, you'd still be invisible." His logic was almost poetic in its delusion. "Richard," I said finally, my tone calm, measured, "you taught me one thing, how to recognize a man who mistakes fear for respect. And I stopped fearing you a long time ago." There was silence, then a quiet, broken chuckle. "You sound just like Evelyn now. Maybe I underestimated you both." The line went dead. That was the last time I ever spoke to him. 2 weeks later, the news broke again. This time, the kind of story that silences an entire room. Former CEO Richard Coleman hospitalized after apparent heart attack. He survived, but barely. The doctor said stress, alcohol, and high blood pressure had taken their toll. Evelyn visited him, but later told me he didn't look like Richard, just a man made of regrets. I thought I'd feel relief. Instead, I felt something stranger, closure, because in that hospital bed, surrounded by the emptiness he'd created, Richard Coleman was finally powerless. Meanwhile, Daniel began to rebuild himself, Slowly, quietly, he moved into a small apartment, started therapy, and even began volunteering at one of the community kitchens I supported. The first time I saw him serve food to a group of homeless veterans, the irony nearly made me cry. The man who once watched me go hungry at a table of abundance, now feeding others. He caught my eye that day, gave me a small, hesitant smile. There was no need for words. We both knew this was his way of saying thank you. Months passed. My speech continued to circulate online, sparking conversations in talk shows and podcasts. I was invited to write a book, part memoir, part reflection on emotional abuse disguised as family loyalty. I titled it The Empty Plate. It felt right. The story that once shamed me had become my strength. And though success found me, I never forgot what started it all. That moment of exclusion that revealed the rot beneath the surface. That dinner table had been more than just a setting. It was a metaphor for every woman who's ever been told she didn't belong, for every person fed crumbs of validation while others feasted on entitlement. By the time my book was published, Richard had retreated completely from public life. His empire dismantled, his name tarnished, his influence gone. He lived quietly, a ghost in his own mansion. Evelyn sold the house and moved closer to her grandchildren. Daniel and I stayed in contact, not as lovers, but as two people who shared the same battlefield. Sometimes we'd meet for coffee and talk, not about the past, but about what came next. One afternoon, as we sat outside a cafe watching the sunset, he said, "You know, I used to think my father was the strongest man I knew, but he wasn't. He was just the loudest." I smiled. Strength isn't about volume, Daniel. It's about what you can carry without breaking. He looked at me, quiet for a moment, then said, "You carried us all, Emma. And I'm sorry it took me this long to see it." For the first time, there was peace between us. Not the fragile kind built on fear, but the honest kind that grows from ruin. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I realized the story wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclamation, of identity, of worth, of voice. Richard had fallen. His empire was dust. And from that dust, something far stronger had risen.
Months passed like the slow unwinding of a long, painful storm. The noise around the Coleman scandal began to fade, replaced by newer stories of greed and downfall. But inside me, the echoes of that night, the night I was denied a plate, denied dignity, still lived. They didn't haunt me. They reminded me. They whispered that silence had once been my prison and that speaking my truth was my freedom. Life had changed, but closure was still unfinished. Because while Richard Coleman had lost his power, I sensed he hadn't yet faced his truth, the moral reckoning that comes when a man must finally look at the ruin he created. Then, one afternoon, Evelyn called. Her voice was soft, distant, the kind of tone that carried both sadness and relief. "Emma," she said, "Richard isn't doing well. He asked for you." I froze. For months, I had imagined this moment. The man who once looked at me like I was invisible, now needing me. But when it came, I didn't feel triumph, just an ache, deep and complicated. "Why me?" I asked quietly. "Because," Evelyn said after a pause, "you're the only one who ever stood up to him, and he finally wants to understand why." I agreed to go, not out of forgiveness, but out of a strange human curiosity, the desire to see the fall of a man who once believed he was untouchable. When I arrived at the nursing facility, the man I saw was unrecognizable. His once commanding posture had collapsed into frailty.
His hair, once slicked back in authority, hung in thin gray strands. The fire that once burned in his eyes was replaced by the dull reflection of regret. He looked up from his wheelchair and studied me for a long time. "You came," he said, voice trembling but still heavy with that old pride. "I did," I replied simply. The silence between us was thick, stretching like a rope pulled between two cliffs, one built of arrogance, the other of endurance. "I've had time to think," he began, coughing weakly, "about everything, about that day at the table." My jaw tightened, but I said nothing. I told myself it was about tradition, that blood came first. But it wasn't about blood, was it? It was about control, about reminding everyone that I decided who belonged. He looked down at his hands, trembling, veined, powerless. "You broke that the day you stood up. Do you remember what you said?" "I remember," I said quietly. "I asked if I was family or not." He nodded, and in that moment, I realized I didn't know what family meant anymore. It was surreal hearing this from him, the same man who once humiliated me with a smile. But what surprised me wasn't his guilt. It was his awareness. I lost everything I built, and I used to think the worst part was losing the company. But now I know it's losing the people who believed in me. Evelyn, Daniel, even you. He looked at me, and for the first time, there was no command in his gaze, only plea. "Do you hate me, Emma?" I took a breath. The younger me, the woman who sat hungry at that dinner table, heart pounding with humiliation, might have said yes. But time, grief, and growth had transformed anger into something different. "I don't hate you," I said slowly, "but I won't pretend to pity you either. You hurt people, Richard. You use kindness as a leash and love as a weapon. What you're feeling now, that emptiness, it's not punishment, it's consequence." He closed his eyes, nodding weakly. "Consequence," he whispered, as if tasting the word for the first time. "You're right." We sat in silence for a while, the clock ticking in the background. Then he said something I never expected. "I read your book," he said. That startled me. "You did?" He smiled faintly. "The nurse brought it in. I almost threw it away, but I didn't. You wrote that sometimes silence feeds the beast more than hate ever could. I think I finally understand that." It was strange the way remorse softened even the hardest voice. His words didn't erase the past. Nothing could, but they filled a gap I hadn't known was still open. "Evelyn visits every day, but she doesn't look at me the same. I can't blame her. I used to think power meant being feared. Now I know it means being remembered with kindness, and no one will remember me that way." I looked at him for a long time. Maybe not, but it's not too late to do one thing right. He tilted his head. "And what's that?" "Apologize. Not just to me, but to them. To Evelyn, to Daniel, to yourself. Tell the truth before it's too late." He swallowed hard, and for a moment, the man who once dictated rooms was gone. What remained was an old man clutching the edges of a life defined by pride. When I stood to leave, he said softly, "Thank you for coming. I never deserved your kindness." I paused at the door. "No," I said, "but you did deserve the truth, and now you have it." When I walked out into the sunlight, the air felt lighter, as if I'd finally exhaled the last breath of a long, suffocating silence. I didn't look back. 2 weeks later, Evelyn called again. Her voice was calm, steady. She said, "He passed away in his sleep, peacefully." I sat down, my heart unexpectedly still. "Was he alone?" "No," she said softly. "I was there. He said he wanted to go with honesty on his lips. He asked you to tell me, thank you for making him see." I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just closed my eyes and whispered a quiet prayer, not for him, but for everyone who'd ever been silenced, overlooked, or humiliated and found the courage to stand anyway. At the funeral, the world saw a quiet, dignified ceremony, no lavish displays, no grand speeches, just a handful of family and old friends. When the priest asked if anyone wanted to say something, Evelyn stepped forward. Her voice didn't tremble when she said, "He was a man who learned too late what love really was, but at least he learned." That night, as I returned home, I stood by the window watching the rain fall against the glass. I thought about that first dinner table, the smell of steaks, the clinking of glasses, the moment I became invisible. And now, years later, my voice had not only broken the silence, but outlived it. Richard Coleman's empire was gone, but the lessons remained, burned into the foundation of every room I would ever walk into again. Never let anyone define your worth. Never wait for permission to exist. And above all, never let silence be misunderstood.
After Richard's funeral, the air around the Coleman family shifted, not dramatically, but subtly, like the quiet stillness that follows a long storm. The house that once hosted lavish dinners and unspoken competitions was sold, its grand halls emptied of the cold laughter that had once defined it. Evelyn moved to a smaller home near the coast, a modest, sunlit cottage where the walls didn't echo with commands. She told me she spent her mornings tending to flowers, something Richard had always dismissed as a waste of time. I visited her often, not out of duty, but because I found in her a kind of peace I hadn't known existed before. Evelyn had softened, but she had also grown stronger. One afternoon, as we sat by her small garden, she handed me a weathered envelope. Inside was a letter, Richard's handwriting, faint but deliberate. It read, "Emma, if you are reading this, I am gone. You were right. Silence feeds cruelty, and I built my life on it. I took pride in control because I feared insignificance. But in trying to make others small, I became smaller myself. Thank you for standing when no one else would. I wish I had listened sooner. Richard." I folded the letter carefully, my chest heavy but calm. It wasn't redemption, but it was recognition. And sometimes that was enough. After his death, something unexpected happened. The public, who once devoured every scandal about the Colemans, began to talk about the other side of the story. My side. My book, The Empty Plate, gained momentum again. Book clubs discussed it, women wrote to me from all over.
Wives, daughters, sisters, even sons, sharing their own stories of their own dining tables, their own invisible humiliations. It wasn't fame, I felt. It was purpose. One night, while checking my email, I found a message from a young woman named Mariah. Dear Emma, I read your book. My father-in-law treats me the same way your father-in-law treated you. Last week, I decided to stop apologizing for existing. Thank you for getting me the courage to say no. I read that message twice, tears welling up. It struck me that the real victory wasn't in Richard's downfall. It was in the ripple effect of resistance. Every woman who found her voice because I used mine was part of the legacy I was building, one stronger than any corporate empire could ever be. Meanwhile, Daniel's transformation continued to surprise me. He had started a small consulting agency focused on ethical business practices, ironic considering his family's history, but when I visited his office, I saw a framed photo of his volunteers, all smiling in a community shelter. On his desk sat a small plaque. Integrity is what you do when power tempts you to forget kindness. I smiled when I saw it. It was something I'd once said to him. He invited me to lunch one day, this time at a quiet family-owned diner. No lavish pretense, no invisible walls between us. As we sat across from each other, he said, "You know, I think about that day a lot." "The dinner?" I asked. He nodded. "Yeah, the night Dad excluded you. It used to haunt me because I didn't say anything. But now, I see it as the moment that woke me up. That night changed all of us, Emma. You just saw it first." There was no bitterness in his tone, only reflection. "Maybe," I said softly, "sometimes humiliation is a seed. Painful, buried deep, but one day it grows into something none of us expect." He smiled faintly. "You were always good with metaphors." We laughed, genuinely, for the first time in years. There was no pretense, no resentment, no unspoken shame, just two people who had been through hell and come out wiser. As months turned into a year, I found myself speaking at conferences, women's empowerment events, and community programs. Each time I stood on stage, I began with the same sentence. It started with an empty plate. The audience would always fall silent, drawn into the simplicity of it, because everyone, at some point, had felt that emptiness. One day, after a conference, an older woman approached me. Her silver hair framed kind, knowing eyes. She said, "Your story reminded me of my daughter. She married into a family that treats her like a shadow. But after hearing you speak, I think she'll finally come home." That night, I realized the power of stories, not just to heal, but to rescue. My voice had once been dismissed at a dinner table, but now it was echoing through rooms filled with women who refused to stay quiet anymore. Meanwhile, Evelyn became one of my biggest supporters. She even attended one of my book readings, sitting quietly in the back until the end. When she approached me afterwards, she said something that stayed with me forever. "You didn't just survive my husband, Emma. You healed the rest of us." Her words hit me deeply, because in truth, I hadn't intended to heal anyone. I just wanted to be seen. But sometimes visibility itself becomes medicine. A year after Richard's passing, Daniel invited me to a family dinner. Not in the old mansion, but in Evelyn's cozy home by the sea. For a moment I hesitated, remembering the ache of that first night, the stakes, the laughter, the exclusion. But something inside whispered, "Go. This time it will be different." When I arrived, the smell of roasted vegetables and baked bread filled the air. Evelyn greeted me with a warm hug. Daniel set the table, and to my surprise, there was a place set for me right in the center. A full plate, a glass of wine, and a small handwritten card beside it that read, "Family isn't blood. It's who we choose to feed." For a moment, emotion caught in my throat. I looked at Evelyn, who simply smiled and said, "You've had an empty plate long enough, dear. Eat." That night was quiet but beautiful. No judgment, no tension, just warmth, laughter, humanity. Every clink of cutlery felt like an unspoken apology from the past. Later, as we sat by the fire, Daniel said softly, "You know, I think about Dad would have wanted this. Peace." I nodded. Maybe, but peace doesn't come from what he wanted. It comes from what we chose to do after. Outside, the waves crashed gently against the shore. The moon reflected on the water like silver forgiveness. That night, when I drove home, I realized something profound. The story that began with exclusion ended with inclusion. The same table that once made me feel invisible had transformed into a symbol of acceptance. The silence that once suffocated me had become my strength. My father-in-law had once tried to define my worth with a single empty plate. But in the end, that plate had become the vessel of my power. Because sometimes what breaks you isn't meant to end you. It's meant to remake you. And I had finally been remade.
Time has a strange way of softening even the hardest memories. Years after that fateful dinner, after the fall of Richard Coleman and the quiet rebuilding of what he'd once broken, I found myself sitting in my own home office, surrounded by stacks of letters from strangers. People from across the country, even across oceans, had written to me, sharing how the empty plate had changed their lives. Some were daughters-in-law like me, others were employees, sisters, or quiet souls who'd spent years sitting at tables where they were never truly seen. Each letter carried a common thread, a desire to reclaim dignity. One message, though, stopped me cold. It came from a young man named Liam. He wrote, "I grew up watching my father belittle my mother in front of his family. I used to think it was normal. But after reading your story, I finally apologized to her for never speaking up. I'm starting a support group for men who want to break the cycle." That was the moment I realized my story was no longer just mine. It had evolved into something universal, a mirror reflecting every quiet injustice that goes unspoken behind closed doors. And that realization changed everything about how I lived. I began traveling, speaking not just to women, but to entire communities, teaching that emotional neglect isn't always shouting. Sometimes it's silence. I told them about that night at the Coleman table, the smell of seared steaks, the polished laughter, the way my empty plate gleamed under the light while everyone else cut into theirs. I told them how humiliation can taste like nothing, and how that nothing can fill your soul until you decide to spit it out and speak. My talks weren't about revenge or victimhood. They were about reclaiming space, about saying I deserve to be here. I deserve to eat. One of the most unexpected things happened during one of these events in Chicago. As I finished my keynote speech, a familiar face appeared in the crowd. Daniel. He waited until everyone else had left before walking up to me, his hands in his pockets, that same awkward half smile I once fell in love with. "You were incredible," he said softly. "Thanks," I replied, smiling back. "I wasn't sure you'd come."
Mom told me," he said. "She's proud of you. We both are." We stood in silence for a moment before he said, "You know, Dad would have hated this." I laughed. "Oh, absolutely." "But," Daniel added, "I think he would have respected it too. You did what he never could. You made people listen without fear." That sentence stayed with me because, in a way, Daniel was right. My voice had become what Richard's power had pretended to be: influence born from truth, not fear. As months turned into years, the Empty Plate Foundation was born, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting people silenced in family or professional hierarchies. The logo was simple: a white plate with a single golden line through the center, a reminder that what's cracked can still be beautiful. I worked with shelters, therapy centers, and community leaders, and every time we handed a meal to someone who felt unseen, I thought back to that first dinner table and smiled. Life, in its poetic way, had come full circle. Evelyn continued to be a quiet pillar of strength. We'd often sit together by the shore, sipping tea as the waves licked the sand. She once said, "You know, Emma, you remind me of the women I used to envy, brave, unbreakable. But I see now you're not unbreakable. You just refuse to stay broken." Her words warmed me more than she could know, because that was the truth of it. I had been broken, deeply, publicly, and painfully, but I had chosen to rebuild in daylight. One evening, after a long speaking tour, I returned home and sat at my dining table, a simple oak set, nothing extravagant. There were 2 plates, one for me, one for a friend who was visiting later. As I poured a glass of wine, I caught my reflection in the window. The woman staring back at me wasn't the quiet, nervous wife who once waited for scraps of approval. She was someone who had learned that self-worth isn't given, it's claimed. The next morning, I received an invitation that brought everything full circle: a request from a national television show to share my story in a special segment called Women Who Redefined Family. They wanted me to speak not as a victim, but as a voice of transformation. When the day came, the studio lights were blinding, but the crowd's silence was grounding. The host asked, "Emma, if you could go back to that night, the night your father-in-law excluded you, what would you say to your younger self?" I thought for a long moment before answering. I'd tell her not to fight for a seat at a table that was never meant to feed her. I'd tell her to build her own and invite others who've been hungry too long. The audience rose in applause. Some cried, others nodded, but what struck me most was the collective understanding in the room, that shared ache of having once been unseen. After the interview, I returned to my hotel and opened my laptop to find another email, this time from Daniel. "Emma, I watched your interview. You made me proud again, not as my wife, but as someone who showed me what courage looks like. I finally understand what you meant all those years ago. Family isn't about who serves you food, it's about who sees your hunger. Thank you for seeing mine." I closed the laptop, tears falling freely, not out of pain, but release. Because this was closure. Not revenge, not vindication, just peace. That night, I stood by the hotel balcony watching the city lights flicker like scattered stars. Somewhere out there, countless tables were being set, some still full of exclusion, others just beginning to make room for the unseen. And maybe somewhere, another woman would look at her empty plate and think of me. Maybe she'd stand. Maybe she'd speak. Maybe she'd walk away from silence and start her own story. Because that's the legacy I wanted to leave. Not a tale about cruelty, but about reclamation. The next morning, before leaving for the airport, I stopped by a small diner for breakfast. The waitress smiled and asked, "Just one?" I smiled back. No, I said softly, for everyone who was ever forgotten. And as I sat there, sunlight pouring across the table, I raised my coffee cup to the memory of a man who once denied me dinner, and to the woman who turned that hunger into power. Because in the end, life always serves justice, just not on the plates we expect.